Trevor, you're one of those space people. You like what's going on up there in the space and the stars and everything.
Mhm.
What's Quebec's contribution to space exploration? Like, what have they done? Yeah, what's out there?
I guess probably the biggest part is where Canada's version of NASA lives. So Canada has a version
Oh,
of
really?
NASA. It's called the Canadian Space Agency. Not even Canadians really know about it, but yes, we do have one. And it's actually just outside of where I live. So I'm in Montreal, in
Mhm.
Quebec, province of Quebec. And so, yeah, it's just outside of Montreal, maybe like a 30, 40-minute drive away. I actually used to work there and take the bus, the hour and a half long bus ride out there. And so we don't launch rockets or anything from Quebec, from Canada, or anything like that. But that is where we do some training with our astronauts. And probably more importantly, that's where we control Canadarm, which is something most Canadians have heard of, maybe not Americans so much, but there's a robotic arm on the International Space Station, and they can control it down from Houston, and the astronauts can control it while they're up in the space station. But we do a lot of controlling it from the Canadian Space Agency, just outside of here in Montreal. I've got some friends that work there,
Very
and
cool.
they're on Instagram and they're like showing, oh, here's today we're grabbing this piece of hardware, and it's like, holy crap, that is cool that we're like actually just controlling this robotic arm not too far away from here.
I knew that Canada had a space agency. I actually did a two-part podcast series on my other podcast, Geography is Everything, about the space race. And one of the things I found out through that episode was just how many different countries actually had a space agency. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but it was far more than I would have thought. It was like, in the high, 80s or 90s or something like that, or maybe even to the low hundreds that had some form of space agency.
Oh,
I don't
okay.
know what that means exactly for each country, but I'm not surprised. I knew Canada had a space agency. I wasn't surprised when you told that. I am surprised that it was based in Quebec for some reason. I don't know why. I guess I just never heard of where the Canada Space Agency is. So,
Yeah, like where we are, we're not too far away from the capital, which is Ottawa.
mhm.
A lot of people think it's Toronto. It is not. It is Ottawa. And so it's probably like a geographic sort of like advantage that it's not too far away from there. Government officials visiting and stuff like that. So probably something like that.
Well, listener, welcome to Around the World with Geoff, the podcast where we explore all of the places of the world, one episode at a time. I'm joined today by my friend Trevor Kjorlien, more commonly known probably as Plateau Astro across YouTube, Threads, Instagram. Is there anything I'm missing there, Trevor?
That's probably all the places I visit every day. So that's good enough. That's great. Yep.
Awesome. So go check him out if you want space stuff. He's going to help me talk all about, well, the province of Quebec today. Should be a lot of fun. Trevor, I had you on my other podcast, Geography is Everything, to talk all about the moon the other week now.
Mhm.
I guess it's been a couple weeks since we're recording this on July 16th. That was a lot of fun. And I was like, this person is so much fun to talk about. I have this other podcast about just places. Everybody's from a place. Let's bring Trevor back on to talk about his place. And you happen to be from Quebec, which I think is an amazing place to explore.
Happy to be here. Happy to talk about Quebec. So yeah, pepper the questions at me. Let's do it.
Well, let's go ahead and start with a question here. Where would you say that you're from? And I think be as specific as you like.
Yeah. So right now I live in Montreal, in Quebec, but I was born in Western Canada, in Alberta. And I think I mentioned this on the last podcast we did together. That's like just above Montana. It's like where the Rocky Mountains sort of like go up through the States, up into Canada on the western part of the province. That is the ridge of Alberta. So I grew up in a small town. It's called Drayton Valley. We had 6,000 people in our town. It was an oil-based town. The town sign said oil capital of the world, which is a lie. It's probably someplace in like the Middle East somewhere. But yeah, that was
Probably.
a very oil-based economy there. So lived there, grew up there 18 years, and then moved to the capital city, which is called Edmonton. And if anybody watched any of the hockey over the last few weeks, Edmonton Oilers, we lost in Game 7, but we came close. So I was cheering for the Oilers the last few weeks. But yeah, since 2012, so the last 12 years, I've been living here in Montreal, in Quebec.
Great. Yeah. I know. So I remember when I approached you about sort of talking about a place, I threw out Alberta because obviously you told me, on our last podcast that you were from there. It's like, well, maybe you can do Alberta and or Quebec. You chose Quebec, rightfully, because you're there right now. But it also makes me think like, man, Alberta would be a really fun episode because there's a lot of interesting things about Canada as a whole. But Alberta is particularly interesting because it has two relatively large cities, not very far away from each other, but in an area where if it was situated in the US, there would be no major cities. And that's like this really interesting thing. And it has to do with obviously the oil industry that sort of boomed up there, but geographically, it's fascinating. At some point, I'll have somebody here from Alberta and I can dig into this with them a little bit.
I'll change my name and I'll come back. I can do something else. Just call me Travis, Travis K or something like that. And we'll figure it out.
we'll have Travis on. All right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, listener, we are going to talk all about Quebec today. This is one of Canada's many provinces. You might have already listened to an episode on the Netherlands where I had Kjorlien During from History with Kjorlien on. Sometimes we're going to do countries. More often than not, we'll probably do countries. This time we're going to do a province. I would say more often than not, if we're doing somebody who's from somewhere in the United States or Canada, we're going to choose a province or a state. Just because so many of my listeners are either from the United States or Canada, they're probably more interested in sort of the different places around their own country. Maybe someday I'll do Canada as a whole. We'll see. If I ever get Ryan Reynolds on, I'll do Canada as a whole. So let's go ahead and dive into an overview of Quebec in Canada. Trevor, how would you describe where Quebec is located?
Yeah, I would probably describe it, and people in another part of the country will describe it differently. I would say it's more on the eastern part of Canada. So if it's above sort of like Maine, and there's a ton of little states in the United States that I always get mixed up, but I know Maine is around there. It is above New York State. So it's sort of on the eastern side of that. We do have more provinces east of this. So it's like center east, you could say. But yeah, goes on the more eastern part of it. We are in the Eastern time zone, which is a big time zone. But even more to the east of that, we have the Atlantic time zone. But yeah, it's mostly on the eastern sort of part. This is more Montreal specific, but what's interesting to me, and for geography map people, this is probably more interesting. Montreal is basically at 45 degrees latitude. Now, I know Quebec is a very large province and stuff like that, but as an astronomer and sort of a burgeoning maps dork, 45 degrees latitude is like super interesting to me because that's like the halfway point between the North Pole and the equator. And I did a video with CBC, which is like our version of, how would you describe it? Like PBS or BBC?
Yeah,
like
I think
our
so,
version.
yeah. Mm-hmm.
So I've done some videos with them, and a video I did about a year ago is called Finding the Middle. And it's basically me trying to find the exact spot that is like the halfway point between the North Pole and the equator. And so I found it. You use maps and you try to find the exact latitude there, taking into account that the Earth is not a perfect sphere, but it's sort of like a little bit squished. And so it was like east of Montreal in like this like crossroads and like this rural part. So I like put a stick in there. I'm like, okay, here it is. There's the equator and there is the North Pole, and I'm halfway between the two. I know that's very specific, but specific. Yeah, that's Quebec.
Is that video online somewhere? Is that someplace that we can point our listeners to if they want to go check that out?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
It features my dog in it too. So yeah,
awesome. It'll be in the show notes. So listener, if you want to go watch that, check out the show notes or the YouTube description. Either way, it'll be there. You can go check that out. It's geographically, that sounds like a really fun video to watch. So I'm probably going to check it out right after this. So you had mentioned a few different things about Quebec. It's located in the eastern part of Canada. And I would say here's a question for you, because I was sort of butting my head up against this. Is Quebec considered to be an East Coast province?
I think if you are from some of the other provinces, which are east of here, like New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, they would say a definite no. If you are from the western part of Canada, like British Columbia, Alberta, Saskatchewan, You know, it plays with your head that like that Quebec, you just sort of think that it's more east when it's actually probably a bit
Right.
more central. Quebec, it does sprawl quite a bit from west to east, and there's parts of Quebec. So specifically, I'm thinking of a city called Gaspé, Versailles,
Mhm.
and those are kind of on the coast-ish. A little bit of water sort of blocking them, so you are getting some of the Atlantic currents coming on in. Generally, you would say no, it is not. It is not.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, not coast.
This
I would take out the word coast. Probably, I would say it's more of an eastern province,
Eastern province.
but not coast. Let's say.
It is interesting because how you're describing it kind of makes me think of when somebody from the East Coast. 'Cause I'm from the West Coast of the United States. I've always been either in Alaska, Oregon, or California. Maybe someday I'll live in Washington just to complete the set.
Mhm.
But I've always been on the West Coast, and I have a number of friends and people who live in sort of the Midwest or eastern parts of the United States, and they will generally start to refer to anything about Colorado to California as West Coast in some
Mhm.
form, or Nevada. Let's take Nevada, which is not on the coast at all. That has no water access to the Pacific Ocean. Nevada is a West Coast state, and I'm like, well, not really. I wouldn't describe it as
It's
such, but I
west-ish,
definitely
but
heard
definitely
that.
not coast. Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
And that
Yeah.
kind of sounds like maybe the similar thing, aside from the fact that Quebec is directly connected to the Atlantic Ocean by way of the Gulf of St. Lawrence.
Yeah.
So I don't know. It feels a little bit different. And, Quebec has coastal towns. I mean, Quebec City is basically right there on the coast. If my mental map is correct, it's
Yeah, and maybe that's. I'm just thinking out loud here. Maybe that's like where some of the maybe misnomer is the right word. Montreal and like a lot of Quebec is a big like shipping hub because, as you mentioned, the Gulf to St. Lawrence, you get a lot of shipping coming into there. When you think of shipping, you
right.
think of, oh, okay, that's got to be like a coastal place. The St. Lawrence is very very big, and so it's very long, and so like here in Montreal, it's like, hey, we got this big shipping thing here, but like we don't consider Montreal like a oceanside
Right.
city at all. So, but you do get a lot of shipping. So,
Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about shipping and sort of the St. Lawrence River, later on the episode. But I did want to talk a little bit more about Quebec City because this is the earliest North American settlement of, well, what was New France at the time. And so it was founded, way back when, and it was basically the home and capital of New France for 229 years before basically the entirety of what was then known as, I think, Lower Canada, but sort of modern day Quebec was ceded to Great Britain after, I think it was the French and Indian War. And this is interesting because of one aspect that still is an aspect of Quebec today, and that is that it is largely a French-speaking province. Trevor, why do people still speak French in Quebec when it's been sort of within this Anglosphere for so long?
yeah, I mean, you nailed a lot of the history probably better than I would be able to recall from my grade
I
level
have the advantage
history
of
classes.
preparing for this and writing the outline, so
Yeah. So like as you kind of mentioned, like we were a French colony for a long time until like I did have to Google this before until like 1763. We basically had to surrender to the British, and but we that French culture, the language and the culture does remain. So yeah, the official language in this province is French. All the other provinces, the official language is English. There is another province just to the east of us, New Brunswick, where the official languages are English and French.
mhm.
So yeah, Quebec is sort of this weird little capsule of French culture. I should say predominant French culture here. A lot of the other provinces do have little pockets of French speaking communities and stuff like that. It's like that's not unheard of for people in other provinces to be speaking French, but like it's in your face here, so to
Right.
say, in Quebec. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's I definitely think it's unique. I know there's this commonly known law of sorts, out of policy, I don't know, where everything in Canada has to be in two languages, right? It has to be, if you have a sign, a whatever sign, a sign that's a road sign, it has to be in English and in French. And that is due to the Quebec sort of province and sort of the way that the fact that they speak French there as an official language.
Yeah. So when you go to a grocery store here in Canada, one side will be in English and the other side it'll be in French, which is like very cool kind of growing up that you get to like sort of be exposed to it. In Western Canada, I think, at least in my time growing up, I think we probably just should have did a better job of exposing kids to French a bit more. As far as like road signs go, not all, like if you have a stop sign.
Okay.
Here in Quebec, it'll just say arrête for stop.
Yeah.
But then, if you go to any other province, it'll just say stop. It won't have both on there. But the provincial government here does try very actively to make and protect the French language. And I'll give you an example of that. It's like you've been talking about like my social media and stuff like that. And like I do all of it basically in English. My website, some pages are in French, okay, like the about page and the contact page and stuff like that. But there's a few pages where it's like, I'm sorry, I haven't put my workshop description in French. It's only in English. There is a thing jokingly called the language police here. There is an official name for it. I'm fanning on the name right now, where they do contact businesses and say, hey, your menu has to have French on it. It could maybe be in both, but it has to have French on it. And so for years I've been like sort of coasting like, oh, okay, I haven't gotten contacted yet. Until last month when I got an email from them saying,
oh, no.
Hey, we got a complaint. Somebody complained that your website is not in both. So I got about 6 more weeks until I got to like rewrite some of my code and emails that I send out.
No.
It's not a huge deal. And like, I'm not here to complain. This place has been very, very good to me. So I'm like, okay, I got to comply or else have to pay.
I was about to say, I hope this podcast doesn't spotlight you, but it sounds like you've already been.
Oh, I think I should be okay. Yeah.
Well, we're gonna move on. We're gonna do some other Quebec things here in a minute. We got to I got to kind of make some money off of this podcast, so we got to hit our very first ad break, and we're gonna come back and we're gonna talk about sort of the population, some city stuff, all within Quebec. So I guess with that, we will be right back. This summer, let the only thing smoking at your barbecue be the grill, not your grooming game. Get ready for the ultimate cookout season with Manscaped. Whether you're flipping burgers or cannonballing into the pool, make sure your meat looks neat with the Performance Package 5.0 Ultra. And right now, you can head to manscaped.com, use code Geoff for 20% off and free shipping. Here's what's included. The Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra, perfect for achieving that crisp, clean, and confident look for your barbecues and beach days. The Weed Whacker 2.0, keep your ears and nose as tidy as your hedges next door with this ear and nose trimmer. Crop Soother Ball Aftershave Lotion, post-trim care never felt so good. Crop Preserver Anti-Chafing Ball Deodorant, for those sunny beach days and barbecue parties. Boxers 2.0, equipped with the signature jewel pouch to protect your meatballs wherever the heat takes you. And as a treat, toss in the crop mops with your order, a moist towelette made specifically for your beach balls. So get 20% off and free shipping with code Geoff at manscaped.com. That's 20% off and free shipping at manscaped.com and use code GEOFF. Manscaped, the perfect way to get your patties sizzling this hot summer. And we're back. This is the Around the World with Geoff podcast. We are talking Quebec with Trevor Kjorlien of Plateau Astro. Sorry about that. We are going to dive into some population stuff. So again, another question right off the bat here, maybe a little bit of a trivia question because I don't think I actually gave this one to you, Trevor. But do you know how many people are living within Quebec today?
I know the percentage of all of Canada. It's about, so I can do a little bit of backwards math because Canada just crossed 40 million people and Quebec has about 20%. So it's something, okay, that was a few months ago. I'm going to say like 8.3 million.
You are very close. Not quite though. This is as of 2024. It's the most recent estimates I could get from, I think it was Statistics Canada.
Okay.
And as of 2024 estimates, there are just over 9 million people living in Quebec. So you got really close.
Oh, okay.
Which I would say It's still pretty impressive. Most people, I think, are usually surprised by how many people there are or aren't in their country. So this would make it the second most populated province in Canada, right behind Ontario, which probably isn't a surprise to you or any of our Canadian listeners listening right now.
Mhm.
Would you like to take a guess on where Quebec would rank if it was its own country? So let's say Quebec's its own country. It's completely independent. It's now ranked with all of the countries in the world. Where do you think it would fall?
Right. So I forget who's in first place now. So India would be in first place. China would be second.
Yes.
That's okay. That's
Mhm.
okay. United States, I think, is 3. Brazil would be 4. I would probably say, okay, there's like what, 230 some odd countries, something like that. I would say,
It kind of depends on who's counting, but yeah, sure.
yeah, yeah. I would say, oh gosh, okay, that's that. I'm gonna say 170.
You have drastically underestimated how many countries there are with a very small population. So if Quebec was its own country,
Yep.
it would be the 99th largest country in the world by population, just ahead of the European country of Switzerland. So with that, because these two came in right next to each other, I thought it'd be fun to play a little bit of a game, a little fun comparison game. And I warned you there was going to be a little bit of trivia here, so maybe we're going to do a little bit more of that here. Do you know how many Switzerlands, which again about the same population as Quebec,
Yep.
would fit into a single Quebec?
Geography wise, like how many like
By area size, right?
yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Man. All right. You probably know the website truesizeof.com where you
Oh,
can like
absolutely. I
countries.
love
Yeah,
that website.
of course. Okay, we're up there. Dude, I don't even know how big Switzerland is. I'm gonna say like, okay, 20?
Not a bad guess, actually. Again, you're wrong, but you're not outlandishly wrong. So coming in at a whopping 1.5 million square kilometers, or about 579,000 square miles for my American listeners. This would actually make Quebec larger than the U.S. state of Alaska, by the way, in case people were curious. Quebec's really, really large. So coming in at 1.5 million square kilometers, you could fit Switzerland inside of Quebec 37 times and still have room left over. And I think makes it like a really fun comparison because they both have the same population, right? So it gives you this idea of sort of the density around both these places, right?
Right.
Quebec with 9 million people, Switzerland basically with 9 million people. But obviously, if you're in Switzerland, you're going to see and feel people a lot more than if you're in Quebec, aside from like if you're in Montreal, which is obviously a city of a few million people. And so you're going to, it's just going to be a very different kind of place to visit. And I always love doing those comparisons because I think it helps people understand a little bit more about how size works around the world. This would make Quebec one of the least densely populated countries in the world if it was its own country, with just over 6 people per square kilometer. Now, that said, Quebec as a country would still be more densely populated than Canada itself. So there's something to hang your hat on a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. That's good context. That's awesome.
Yeah. So all of this begs the question, Trevor, what goes on in that far northern area of Quebec?
Yeah.
Is it moose stuff? Is it just moose stuff?
It's so there's some First Nations communities up there. So maybe a little bit of context here. In the United States, I believe we Aboriginal people, depending on what country you talk to, that's what you talk to.
Right.
Yeah.
They're Native Americans here in the United States, First Nations up in Canada, Aboriginals in Australia. Indigenous more broadly, I think is the geographic term that we use. Yeah. With inside sort of my industry. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's several First Nations communities up there. We obviously a bunch of different tribes and stuff like that, but the Inuit are also part of Quebec up there, to the best of my knowledge. It is quite sparsely populated. I have not traveled up to that part of Quebec before. I've been up to northern Canada before, to Nunavut, but not to northern Quebec. So I'm a little bit sparse in my knowledge of that area. But yeah, First Nations communities.
I have to imagine I've never been either. Shocking. I have not been to northern Quebec. I don't think a lot of people have. We're going to talk a little bit about some tourist stuff later in the episode. I can't imagine a lot of people go like up there for this. And the way I would sort of describe it is, I have a lot of people who go to Alaska, a lot of friends who go to Alaska. But what they're usually doing is they're flying into Anchorage. They might go up to Denali, which is a big mountain range just north of, or a big mountain and mountain range just north of Anchorage. They might go down south to the Kenai Peninsula, which is, there's a lot of coastal towns. Very few of them ever go up into northern Alaska. And there's a reason for that, is because there's just not that much up there. It's like pretty barren overall. I used to live up in Anchorage. I've been up as far as Fairbanks, and even Fairbanks, which is again pretty far north, it gets like it's not like particularly geographically interesting. It's not like there's mountains everywhere. It's not like even the forests are kind of sparse. So I imagine it would probably be something similar, because once you get above that Arctic Circle, or once you start getting close to that Arctic Circle, things kind of have a hard time growing, and wildlife kind of has a hard time eating, right? So there's just not that much.
Yeah, and very, very expensive too.
Absolutely.
Is a big issue. Not just to like get up there, but also like food is just insanely expensive. Yeah, there is. Right. It's not so much in northern Quebec there, but in the sort of Yukon, Northwest Territories, Yellowknife area, there is a bit of a burgeoning economy for Northern Lights, Aurora Borealis tourism, which is starting to blossom, especially this season, with it being sort of the top of the solar cycle there. So that is something but I think less so in northern Quebec. So yeah.
I love that you're trying to thread space into our conversation here.
It's all I know how to do.
Well, let's get back to another fun question for you. Can you tell me the top 5 largest cities within Quebec by population?
Okay, so I'm going to say Montreal is at the top.
Yeah, that's usually people get the top one. It's usually the easiest one. Nobody's ever usually surprised by it. Yes, so Montreal is absolutely the top.
Okay, I'm going to say this is actually kind of a bit of a tough one. Okay, it could be Quebec City is number 2, and then I'll say the next one because I might get them swapped. Sherbrooke being number 3.
So you got number 2. Okay. Sherbrooke is actually number 4. So you missed number 3. I think you might be a little surprised at number 3, not because you don't know it. In fact, you've already mentioned it in our episode today.
Oh, have I? Oh my gosh. Okay. Did I say Per se or Gaspé?
You did mention those, but those are not either of them. They're not on the list.
Gosh. Trois-Rivières?
That is number 5.
That's number 5.
You're still missing number 3, though. What if I told you? I'll give you a little bit of a hint.
Yeah.
This is probably going to be a really good hint, because I imagine you're going to get it instantly. It is connected to Canada's capital, but it is within Quebec.
Gatineau?
Gatineau.
Okay. All right. Okay.
So it's funny that I knew that one was probably going to throw you off potentially, because typically people will think of metro area populations more often than city populations, right? If you're thinking about Montreal as a place to have a population attached to, you're going to think, oh, it's about 4 million people. There's not actually 4 million people within Montreal. It's 4 million people in the metro area. And so Gatineau is within the Ottawa metro area. Mm-hmm. Ottawa, I think, has about 1.4 million total, but there's about 271,000 in the Gatineau city itself. And so it makes it for this sort of weird comparison. It's like, well, okay, it is technically the 3rd largest, ahead of Sherbrooke at 227,000, and Trois-Rivières. My French is atrocious.
Trois-Rivières, yeah. Don't worry.
Trois-Rivières at 161,000. So it's sort of a fun sort of aspect of city populations that I had a feeling was going to stump you a little bit.
Yeah. This is like Tuesday night pub trivia at 2:30 in the afternoon Eastern time. Yeah, good.
That's what we're doing. That's the whole game here. That's what I do. One last question before we move on to some physical geography. Outside of your hometown, or I guess where you're living right now, Montreal, what's your favorite city in Quebec and why?
Yeah, this one, I had to think about a little bit. I'm going to say Per se. So this is really far east. This is probably about a 10, 11 hour drive up along the St. Lawrence from Montreal, that is. And so it's coastal, and it's just a really great part of the province. I went there about 3 years ago for the first time and only time. Yeah, just very idyllic, scenic points of view. If you know Marconi, like the telegraphy telegram guy. He did like some experiments and stuff out
Yeah, that sounds
there
familiar.
it's trying to get like signals across the Atlantic Ocean. I think I'm getting maybe some of my history a bit mixed up there, but something like that. And they have this really cool rock. So sometimes you'll see people walk around in Quebec or Montreal called like Per Se Rock, and it's in the style of Tintin. If you ever had that cartoon, Tintin.
Yeah,
It's
Tintin.
like,
No, I absolutely know Tintin. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, and it's like in the style of like Tintin, but like Per Se Rock. It's basically this like big rock along the coast, and depending on the tide, you can like walk to the rock. But if the tide is high, you can't do it. So you gotta like time it there. And the rock has like the sort of arch to it as well, so you can kind of see through it. And just off there, they have this island called Bonaventure Island, and they have the largest colony of gannet birds. We went there and we walked through it, and there's just like,
yeah.
you get there and you're walking through the bushes, and all of a sudden you have to hear this like low quack 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 squawking sound. And you're like, okay. Then you get closer, it gets louder, louder, louder. And finally you get to the edge of the island, and you just see hundreds of thousands of these white birds, and it's just absolute chaos. And it was an amazing sight. So that's like, Per Se, if you have a chance to visit there, that's a really, really cool part of the province.
Per se. Okay, hold on to that information. That's really cool. I think people are going to want to visit it after hearing you talk about it. We're going to talk about some tourist stuff later in the episode as well. And I'm going to ask you a question. I'm going to ask you not to say Per Se again.
Okay.
So
Okay.
think of another place at some point so that people have another sort of place to go visit. Let's go ahead and hit another ad break. Obviously we need to make some money here, do some capitalism stuff. It's what I do best here in the United States, I guess. And we will be right back. As many of you know, I recently opened up my very own online map store, but I had never set up my own store before, and after looking it up, it got complicated really fast. That's why I went with Shopify for my store. They made it so easy. Here's how. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage, to the first real life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit 1 million orders stage? Shopify's there to help you grow. Whether you're selling maps like me or something else entirely, Shopify helps you sell everywhere. From their all-in-one e-commerce platform to their in-person POS system, wherever and whatever you're selling, Shopify's got you covered. Shopify helps you turn browsers into buyers with the internet's best converting checkout, 36% better on average compared to other leading commerce platforms. And you can sell more with less effort thanks to Shopify Magic, your AI-powered all-star. I'm a content creator and podcaster, not a salesperson or computer programmer. So setting up an online map store would have been incredibly challenging to do on top of all of the content I make, were it not for Shopify's easy-to-use tools. And you can get yours set up today as well for a single $1. Sign up for a 1-month trial at shopify.com/ATW, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/ATW now to grow your business. That's shopify.com/ATW, all lowercase. And we're back. We are talking all about Quebec and Canada today with Trevor Kjorlien of Plateau Astro. I'm going to keep doing that. I don't know why. Let's go ahead and do some physical geography. Can you, Trevor, tell us a little bit about the landscape or physical features of where you live? Montreal, I guess.
Yeah, Montreal. I guess, how do we get the name Montreal? In the middle of the city.
I have no idea.
Yeah, in the middle of the city, we have a mountain, in scare quotes. There's like kind of small mountains. It's called Mount Royal, Montreal. And so from what I have read, but I got to confirm with it, I think it is sort of the offshoot of some volcanic something or other. I would love to say it's an old dormant volcano, but I know that is a completely untrue statement, but it has something to do with some sort of volcano sort of thing. So it's this really cool sort of central landmark, like in the middle of the city. And Montreal itself is an island. So you zoom out far enough in Google Maps, like, oh, okay, the island of Montreal, it is an actual island. So in the middle of it, there's this little mountain there, which has a cross on the top that lights up, and some cell phone towers, of course, on it. And yeah, the mountain is just really cool. It's got like a lake on top of it, a really great view looking east, so you can see the sunrise or the moonrise there. And another sort of hidden part of the mountain it's like the best sunset spot in the city. So it's like, as somebody who does workshops and teaches people about navigation and compasses and astronomy and stuff like that, it's like a really great city to teach those aspects of direction and wave. So it's a great part of the city.
I don't think most people would have known that Montreal was an island. Actually, I'm not even sure. I knew it was. So I know it's on the St. Lawrence River, which is a massive river. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a second. I didn't know that Montreal itself, or maybe the core of it, was on an island. This, in a way, this kind of sounds a little bit like Manhattan, right? Manhattan's is a little bit is an island, right?
Exactly. I honestly, like, I was so ignorant when I first moved here. When I moved, I was like in my mid-20s, and I was like, I don't know, life should have been more fun. I was like, okay, I'm going to book a flight to Montreal and just change my life. I knew nothing about Montreal, never visited. And then I remember like a week or so after arriving, I was talking to some people at the hostel, and they were like, yeah, the island of Montreal. I was like, wait, island? And they're like, yeah, Montreal's an island. I'm like, what are you talking about? And they're like, pulled out their phone, pulled out Google Maps, and like zoomed out. I'm like, whoa, there's water all over on every edge. Can't believe I didn't know that. And so I grew up. I learned a big lesson there about the geography of Montreal.
A fun geographic fact is that it would technically be a fluvial island. I'm not sure where it ranks necessarily in sort of the country, but fluvial islands are islands that are within rivers. They're actually they're fairly uncommon, right? I mean, you can typically find small ones, but it'd be pretty uncommon for there to be a large one that also has a large settlement on top of it. So fun little geography fact there. That's off the cuff. That's not prepared either. I just remembered that right off the top of my geographic head here. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the St. Lawrence River. This is a pretty big deal for Canada, the St. Lawrence, I would argue. I think for those of us living in the United States, we're used to hearing quite often about the mighty Mississippi River, right? Because of how much it touches our country. It has a huge watershed. It has a huge impact for the United States at large. The St. Lawrence isn't quite as expansive, but it's still quite large. And if you can believe it, it is the primary, like almost the entire thing. It is the primary drainage river for all of the Great Lakes. There's a few small rivers that connect south, but the vast majority of that drainage from the Great Lakes heads out towards the St. Lawrence and into the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of St. Lawrence, which I did not know that. That was, in preparing for this episode, I was like, wow, that's really fascinating, because if you didn't know, Trevor, the Great Lakes hold fully 21% of the entire world's surface fresh water. So it's, for a single river to be capturing the drainage of all of that is amazing. Yeah. It's astounding. It's a lot of water.
I did not know that. I knew that the St. Lawrence was a big deal. I didn't know. I didn't even think of its connection to the Great Lakes, honestly. I knew that it extended kind of all the way to like Toronto and parts of Ontario and stuff like that. But yeah, that's a surprise.
In fact, there's a whole thing. It's called have you ever heard of the St. Lawrence Seaway?
Yeah. Yes, I have. But again, my knowledge of the St. Lawrence is limited, but I feel like I'm going to get a fact coming right at me in a second here.
I was just learning about it the other day. I have an episode prepared. This actually might come out the same time as this episode, but for my YouTube channel, Geography by Geoff, I have an episode coming out about the Great Lakes, or about the region of the Great Lakes, right? Who's living there. And in that episode, I had to dig into something called the St. Lawrence Seaway. And obviously, I'd heard of the St. Lawrence River. I've talked a lot about it for various videos, but I had not actually heard of this term before. So I went and looked it up. I read all about the St. Lawrence Seaway, and it's just what it says. It's a seaway that connects the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean for shipping purposes. And if you can believe it, it connects all the way to Chicago. So you can load up a barge full of goods in Chicago and then float it all the way through the Great Lakes, through near Detroit, down by Cleveland, up around Toronto, and to Montreal, then to Quebec City, and then out to the Atlantic Ocean. And that is something that shippers do fairly often. I don't know if it's a major shipping route, but it's enough of a shipping route that it has its own name, which I thought was very impressive. For people who don't know, that's done by a system of canals and locks and everything that have been built over the last couple hundred years as well. So,
okay, wow. And you think of like Chicago, it's like I know it's not exactly central, but it's like, it is kind of like,
I mean, it's inland.
yeah, very inland. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Okay.
So exactly. I think when you start thinking about the geography of the Great Lakes and how far away everything is, it's like, oh, I didn't know that Chicago was technically connected to the wider ocean, and that in theory you could take a boat all the way out to the Atlantic Ocean from Chicago if that's what you wanted. And I'm
Yeah.
sure, I mean, shippers do it obviously all the time for recreation. I'm sure you could do it if that's something you wanted. I don't know the details of how you would do that, but it seems to be possible. So all told, the St. Lawrence River drains about 12,000 cubic meters of water every single second on average. It's a lot of water. This would be about half of the average drainage discharge of the Mississippi River, which is about 21,000. So the Mississippi River still has a much larger catchment area, so it's still draining a lot more. But 12,000 cubic meters is still quite a lot. It would still place relatively high in the global rankings. But I am curious if you want to take a stab at what the largest river by drainage discharge is in the world. And I'll give you a hint. It is tied to a very important geographic entity within our world, perhaps the most important.
Gosh, this is like Trevor embarrassment pub hour. Let's see. Okay, is it not in the Americas?
It is in the Americas.
It is in the Americas. Oh, now I'm really. Can I even name another river?
I don't think you're going to be surprised when I say it.
I don't know.
Well,
so give it to me.
It is the Amazon River, which flows through the mighty Amazon rainforest, primarily through Brazil, though it has its origin points in I believe maybe Peru. I can't remember. I think there actually is some debate on where the actual origin of it might be. But if we take those numbers, right, so 12,000 cubic meters per second for St. Lawrence River, 21,000 for the Mississippi River, the Amazon River every single second drains about 224,000 cubic meters of water. That's a lot of water, and it's like the next river down. I can't remember which one it is. It might be the Nile or Europe, maybe the Yangtze or something. The next one down is about 40,000. So the Amazon River is far and away the most dominant river in the world. But I think it makes for an interesting comparison when we look at something like the St. Lawrence River, which is still, I mean, you're right there on the river. You can look out at it probably daily, and you can probably see that's a massive river. That's a huge river. There's not like a little stream going through Montreal,
Yeah. I guess maybe a fun fact for that is so we have a metro system here in Montreal, and so we got 4 lines, and there's an island in the in the river that is man-made, human-made. So it's called Sainte Hélène Island. I think I'm getting but like we have like an amusement park and stuff on there. So it's like it's a totally human-made island, and we got all the dirt from it as we were making the metro system underneath in the 60s. And so all the dirt from that, we crawl out of there, we put it into the river, and we have that there. And there, the yellow line, it actually goes underneath the St. Lawrence River. And so like, that is like a terrifying fact to me whenever I had to ride the yellow line getting to work. I was like, do you know where you are right now? You're under like a freaking river right now. And so, yeah, that blows me away that human engineering can like even dare to do that.
Right? It's wild. It's absolutely wild. So let's move to some higher grounds.
Yep.
We're going to leave the river behind. Now we're going to talk about we're going up. Do you know what the tallest mountain in Quebec is?
Oh, I should know this. Is it like in the Mont Tremblant region? I do not know. Once I hear it, I'll feel silly, but yeah.
Maybe I don't know. There's a fun fact that really tickled me, so we're going to talk about that in a second. But Quebec's highest point at 1,652 meters or 5,420 feet is Mount Cabvic or Mont Iberville.
D'Iberville. Yep.
In the French.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
But the reason why this tickled me so much is because, and this is particularly the geographic side of me that makes me like sort of smirk a little bit. So not only is Mount Cabvic in Quebec the highest point in Quebec, but it's also the highest point in Newfoundland and Labrador, specifically the Labrador part of Newfoundland and Labrador. But the summit itself So you have a mountain. All mountains have a summit, a point, right? Lies 10 meters or 33 feet northeast of the Quebec provincial border and is entirely within Labrador. And I thought that was really funny that the tallest point in Quebec, they don't even have the peak in there. In fact, it's 10 meters away. If the border was just 10 meters one direction.
Okay.
And
I gotta look at a map now.
It's way inside that sort of far northern area of both Labrador and Quebec. But it's just really funny. It's like how that sort of worked out.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. There's one thing before we move on to some history here that I want to talk a little bit about, and that's the Canadian Shield. Have you ever heard about the Canadian Shield?
I heard about this so much as a kid, and like I think for good or ill, I think like American history, and I don't want to say geography, American history just seems a little bit more exciting, and maybe there's bad reasons for that. Whereas Canadian history, so we had what we call social studies here in Canada, and so it's like a mix of geography and history in sort of the same sort of class. Yeah, and there would be like, it felt like we did the same thing multiple years in a row, and I think I had to do a report on the Canadian Shield. So I heard about it for years, and I just remember if you like take the map of Canada, the Canadian Shield eating up like a huge percentage, like 50% of it.
It's huge,
and it's just like the word that comes to mind is like rock. It's just very like just pure rock, basically. And I'm just like, the Canadian Shield, I don't know, it sounded always so boring to me because it's just rock. But apparently it's like that's how we have like a huge mining economy here in Canada. So we get like lots of gold and copper and silver and nickel, all from the Canadian Shield here.
You nailed it. That is almost exactly what the Canadian Shield is. It's a huge area of Canada. In fact, if you look at a map, and if you're watching on YouTube, there'll be a map here. You can see it. If you're looking at a map of the Canadian Shield, it takes up basically almost the entirety of Quebec. I think it takes up almost the entirety of Ontario, and it goes into Manitoba, and I think even Saskatchewan, maybe even sort of the Alberta, and of course those northern territories. None of it, and it might even impact Labrador a little bit. It takes up a huge area. And as you said, it's like this hard Precambrian igneous rock. And it basically it makes it so that you can't really grow anything all that well in any of these areas. So even if you had, better weather, you had, more acclimatized sort of things where you could grow wheat or something in sort of the northern areas, which you really can't right now. The drainage of this is so bad that it makes growing so incredibly challenging. And I thought that was so interesting. But to your point, Canada is able to mine it and is able to get a lot of things such as nickel, such as gold, silver, and copper out of this Canadian Shield, that it sort of pays for itself a little bit. And it's more of a benefit than a negative overall, I would say, at least economically. I guess it depends on how much you value those minerals.
Yeah.
It is funny because the Canadian Shield it's kind of a running joke within geography communities online, particularly the Reddit geography Reddit page. Basically, anytime anybody has a geographic question about Canada, you go into the comment section and see the answers, and like at least half of them are going to be it's the Canadian Shield. It's always the Canadian Shield. It's like that's the answer for everything.
Yeah. Why is it called Shield? Do you know? It
does kind of look like a shield. Yeah. So if you look at a map of it, it kind of like on Canada, it kind of like comes down to like a point, and so it kind of looks like a shield a little bit. And so that would be my best guess. Although if you were actually to look at the full form of the Canadian Shield, it actually extends up into like Greenland and things, and it's more of a oval shape. So, but it obviously water, oceans, there's all that kind of stuff that sort of get in the way of that to see that on as it relates to land. And so it does kind of look like a shield a little bit on a map. And I think that's why. I don't know exactly, but I think I would hazard that guess.
Okay.
Well,
all right,
Trevor, let's move on from physical geography. We have to hit another ad break here so we can make some money. But we're going to be back, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the history of Quebec, dive into sort of some things that happened there over the last few hundred years, a couple hundred years maybe. And yeah, I guess we'll be right back after these ads. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. I currently make my living creating content for you to enjoy week in, week out. While I love what I do, I largely work alone in a silo. This means that I typically rely on comparing myself to other content creators to see how well I'm performing. And that can add further stress that's not needed even when it's an unfair comparison. It's for this reason that I began my therapy journey. I just needed someone to help me contextualize my thoughts and feelings about work. With my therapist's help, I've been able to set meaningful boundaries on my work life that have vastly improved my mental health. But while my situation is maybe a little unique, I don't think I'm alone in having issues at my work or personal life. And if you're thinking of starting therapy, you should give BetterHelp a try. BetterHelp is entirely online, which means it's also very convenient, flexible, and can be adapted to your schedule. You don't need to travel to an office across town. You can do it right from where you're most comfortable, your home. So stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/aroundtheworld today and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/aroundtheworld. And we're back. We are talking all about Quebec with Trevor Kjorlien of Plateau Astro. I knew I was going to get it right after one of these ad breaks here. So we're going to dive into a little bit of history, but a quick caveat, and I make this caveat for every episode. This is not going to be an exhaustive history of Quebec. That's a book. That's a multiple series podcast. That's a whole podcast series unto itself, right? All places that we talk about are going to have a huge history. So I sort of picked and chose a couple different moments that I thought were maybe some defining points of Quebec, or maybe popular ideas that sort of like make Quebec sort of stand out a little bit throughout its history. So I think the first thing that I always like to ask my guests is, as somebody who lives there or who lives in Canada and is from Canada, what do you know about the history of Quebec that you think most people wouldn't ever know, have heard of? You know, people in the US, for example, have never heard of.
I think the thing that like pops up to me, and I learned about Quebec and like Canadian history growing up as a kid, but it wasn't until I went to university and I took a Quebec film studies course that like this became apparent to me, is like how radically the province like shifted in like the 50s and 60s. So there's this period of time in Quebec history called the La Grande Noirceur, which basically means like the great darkness, which is like a pretty intense name for an era.
It's basically Game of Thrones.
yeah. And basically it was like this period of time where like the church, the Catholic Church, controlled a lot of the education, the health system and all that. And so it's just sort of like this very like kind of oppressy sort of feeling there. And so like in the late 50s, early 60s, it was called the Quiet Revolution. And so it was sort of a secularization of the province. So
interesting.
Taking education and putting it into the more publicly controlled, same with healthcare and all that. And so Quebec is a mostly pretty secular place, especially if you're like in major cities like Montreal. It's very, 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 very secular, though there is sort of the current provincial government is, you know, they'll ban certain religious things, and we don't have to get in a whole discussion about this, but then but you have a huge cross on your mountain and stuff like that. So there's like this blend of like, okay, is it cultural, is it religious, stuff like that. But yeah, there was this great shift over in the late 50s, early 60s that I didn't know about until I guess I became an adult and had to go to a Quebec film studies class. So yeah,
that's fascinating. And I like that you use that one, because it's going to hit on a little bit of what we're going to talk about in a second here, which is the sort of Catholicism sort of influence on Quebec, because it's definitely different from the rest of Canada. We're going to talk a little bit about that when we talk about one specific thing, but let's do a little bit of sort of high level Quebec history here. So Quebec is a bit different from Canadian provinces, and we've already talked about this in that it is a primarily French speaking province, you know, right? It was part of New France. It was founded by France, all this kind of stuff. And I would argue that that's not actually that rare globally, to have a province within a country that speaks a other language that is, you know, not maybe sort of the norm, or there's a country that speaks two different languages. You know, Belgium is split between largely Flemish in the north and French in the south, with a smidge of German sort of in the southeast. China, for example, has a very large Cantonese speaking southern region, which is different from the Mandarin of the north. And so Quebec sort of has the same thing going on, within Canada, where it's speaking French. And that is largely to do with its origins as being a French colony. And of course, we talked about this already, the French would cede that territory in 1763 to the British, who obviously weren't French speaking. And that's sort of how you get to this moment where there's a collision of cultures. And it's not just a language collision. Of course, that's a big aspect of it. In fact, in my other podcast, Geography is Everything, Hunter and I will often talk about sort of the language differences and how they sort of clash and butt heads. But there's also a religious difference, because Canada as a whole largely has assumed at this, over the years, has assumed the Anglosphere culture. And England broke away from the Catholic Church a long time ago. They have their whole other thing called Anglicism, something like that. I'm not a religious person, so if I get the actual religion name wrong, I do apologize. But it was Quebec that maintained as a largely Catholic sort of entity within sort of this now union of cultures that was becoming Canada in sort of this late 1700s, even into the early 1800s period. And that's when we get to something that kind of comes to a head in this, and that is something called the Lower Canada Rebellion. Do you know what this is?
I probably heard this so many times as a 13-year-old kid in Mr. Brox's social studies class, and I probably answered the question correctly. But goddamn, if I didn't have to Google search this beforehand and re-up my brain on this. I mean, basically, I have the answer in front of me. Do you want me to just say the answer?
Give us the answer. That's what we're here for.
The year is 1837. It is like October 1837, and there's these French Canadian nationalists, and they're basically really kind of ticked off at this British rule. And so the reason why is like the Francophones, they don't have much economic power. They don't have much political power, even though they have seats and stuff like that. And so, yeah, late 1830, they said, okay, we're sick of this. We're going to try to beat the crap out of you and take over. And ultimately, it was kind of unsuccessful from what I've
Very
read.
much so.
This went on for, I think, like a year or something like that. But ultimately, it was an unsuccessful, unless you correct me, an unsuccessful takeover.
It was very unsuccessful. So exactly what you said. So Lower Canada, which is kind of present day Quebec. I mean, there are differences, of course. When you go back, maps get different and borders get less defined. Let's say, but Lower Canada is present day Quebec, and there was Upper Canada, which is sort of the rest of sort of the colonies of Britain at the time. So Ontario broadly, let's say, and so. When this sort of happened, this French-speaking sort of population was largely rural. They were very Catholic. They felt marginalized, as you said. They decided that they needed a rebellion, and this is not that long after the United States had repelled from Great Britain and sort of carved out their own sort of territory. So there might have been some inspiration there. This is this is 1837, so it's about 50 years later. Again, this is something that's happening also well within much of the Americas, right? Mexico had its own rebellion. A lot of the South American countries rebel against Spain, and they start to push back and say, hey, we want our own thing. So they're probably thinking the same thing. Unfortunately for them, they didn't win. But what I thought was kind of interesting here is that when they were starting to lose this rebellion, a lot of they're called the Patriot groups. A lot of them fled into the United States to basically, try and save themselves to not be pursued. And I thought that was really interesting because if you go back far enough, the United States and Great Britain, or the UK today, pretty solid friends geopolitically. You go back into the early 1800s, not friends. They're very much competing. They're very much, Great Britain's still upset that they, revolted and became their own country, all of this kind of stuff. There was a whole extra war called the War of 1812 that occurred. So this was only a couple of decades after that. So it was definitely an interesting thing, I think, for them to flee into the United States, because they knew that Great Britain probably wasn't going to go after them and try and start yet another war with this country, that they've already tangled with a couple of times. So like you had mentioned, they lost. So Quebec was more formalized. There were some things that occurred out of this. The British government responded by uniting Upper and Lower Canada into a single political entity. This would be called the Province of Canada in 1841. This is ultimately where Canada would come from, right? The country that we know today sort of spawned out of this unity. And that's where, eventually they become provinces, all that kind of stuff. And for a while, this all seemed to work fairly well, broadly, not saying it was perfect. But there was something different that sort of happened later on, closer to where we are today. And if you were around in the 1990s, if you were alive and you were well of the geopolitical situation, you might recall that Quebec did try to secede from Canada. In fact, they held a whole vote on it, and the no vote only won by 0.5% of the vote. That no meaning that they wanted to stay in Canada. Mm-hmm. Trevor, why did Quebec try to secede in the 1990s?
Okay, as you're describing that, I'm thinking of a scene from The Simpsons where like Homer and Marge are like having an argument, and Homer's obviously losing it, and then he picks up a newspaper. Oh, can't talk now, Marge. Canada's having referendum or something like that. I forget the exact quote. So if you need a bit of a pop culture
we always need pop culture references.
Yeah. I wasn't there during the time. I was 7 years old when this happened, but I think I have memories of like this sort of like going sort of on, and the adults sort of talking about this and seeing newspapers about this. Why did they want to separate? I remember the word separate instead of secede. Yeah, separate. Why did Quebec want to separate? Again, I was too young to like actually live it, but like even to this day, it sort of does exist here. Again, I'm an Anglophone, so I'm sort of seeing it from like an outside looking in perspective. But like, there's a big portion of the population here that like considers it like sort of a unique culture, and like obviously like the language is a big part of that, but also just like culturally, just like some of the values are kind of different. There's also like a little bit of a history to this, which goes back before the 1990s. This would be sort of in that 1950s Grand Noirceur kind of era. During that time, to the best of my French Quebec film class history, Anglophones did control a lot of the businesses and a lot of the economy here in Quebec. And so when we did that sort of switch over in the 60s, that also switched to the Francophones did get a lot more of that power back, the like economic power back. So there is like some history of that too. So yeah, so the 1990s comes around, and there are political parties that like want to do this. They put it up to a referendum, and yeah, it was very, 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 very close. And I think ultimately they just kind of do consider themselves as just a different sort of culture. And in some ways, like I don't want them to separate, but like I can kind of like I can disagree, but I kind of get it. It's a weird sort of thing to sort of live in, and like living in Alberta and visiting Ontario and other provinces, like you can recognize like, okay, this is a different place. We're not driving on like the left-hand side of the road or anything here, but like it does feel like a very different province if you were to travel to each different province here.
It's interesting because obviously the most noticeable difference is the language. But language has a way of permeating through so much of our culture that we don't even really realize, right? The way that we communicate things in different languages has an impact on how culture develops, how things are built, even how, what is your cultural sort of touch points, what's culturally prominent, so you start to think about these things that relate to sort of French and the language, and you start thinking of these other aspects of French culture. Not to say that Quebec is French, but sort of the ties that are there. And you start thinking, okay, you can start to see like, yeah, there's probably some differences between the Anglosphere provinces, such as Ontario, which are led by an English language. And these things are very subtle, but over tens of years, hundreds of years, thousands of years even, they start to form their own identity around a single language. And to me, it's like, yeah, it's not surprising. I'm not a big believer in countries separating or seceding, states seceding, whatever you want to call it. I'm not a big believer in that. But it's also like, to your point, I'm like, I get it though. I see sort of the logic and the argument for why that might be fun, or might be, maybe not fun, that might be a wrong word, why that might be culturally, something that you desire.
Yeah. I think to bring it back to The Simpsons, as I must do, I think some people have an outsider's perspective. They're like, oh, Quebec is just sort of Canadians who just sort of speak French. So there's a French version of The Simpsons. Okay. And they do it and stuff like that. There is like a Quebecois version of The Simpsons, and it's different. It's different voices and it's different jokes. And like, I think even French people who live here in Quebec, who grew up with the French version, they watch the Quebecois version. They're like, oh, actually this version is like much better. The voices are done better. The jokes are like more pertinent, and they make jokes that are not just like retellings of like the same American things. Obviously a lot of that has to be done, but there's like Quebecois specific references inside of there. Again, I'm this is sort of secondhand because my partner, she'll tell me this, and other people who watch it. I actually haven't watched enough of it to kind of like, but maybe The Simpsons can sort of help us explain why Quebecois believe it is a very unique culture. Yeah.
Well, Trevor, let's go ahead and hit sort of our final section today. We're going to leave history behind. We're going to do some tourist and visitor information. Obviously, that's probably why people are mostly listening to this. They want to visit Quebec someday. And you're going to play our helpful guide for the episode. So you're going to be helping to guide people where they might want to go. So now you already gave us a little bit of an answer before. I'm going to ask you to do something a little bit different. So that could very well have been your answer otherwise. But pick another place in your head. If you could, if someone only had a single day to visit Quebec, but you could send them anywhere, they could go anywhere within the province, where would you send them?
Yeah. So before I said one of my favorite places other than where I live is Percé. But for this one, I got to go with, can I use my hometown where I live right now?
You can absolutely use your hometown. Okay. If it's Montreal, it's Montreal.
Okay. And I even have a brief itinerary. So if you're in Montreal, I would go during the summertime. There's a bunch of like festivals and stuff all the time. It's a very multicultural city. Go walk down Saint Laurent. We have a great festival called the Mural Festival. And we basically have these sides of the buildings. And each year for about a week or 10 days, that street is closed off and different mural artists go there and they put new murals on the sides of the buildings. And these murals are like 2, 3, 4 stories tall. Just walking on there. That's a great like walk to do. Go to a poutine place, and poutine is like fries with gravy and cheese curds on them. I think it's probably become
so delicious.
It's getting a bit more popular around North America, I think, but we did it here first, I think. So yeah, do that. I can tell you a specific one. Go to Mapu Mouillé. It means wet chicken, something like that. Anyways, it's a good Portuguese poutine place. Go to a dépanneur. And a dépanneur is basically it's like a convenience store, but not like 7-Eleven. It's like basically they're like these little stores that are like all around Montreal. And you can buy beer there. And I guess in Canada, that's a unique thing. I'm not sure in the States, but you can like buy beer there and you can drink in public here if you have food with you.
Oh,
so
very cool.
Buy some good beers. We got a lot of breweries and stuff here. So got a good choice. Get that. Go to Parc La Fontaine. And Parc La Fontaine is this big, massive park. I think designed by the same people that also designed Central Park. And they also designed Montreal Park too. And go hang out there, drink some beers and eat some poutine. And then at night during the summertime, we have this area downtown called Place des Arts, or Arts Place. And there's just like free concerts there all the time. We just had Jazz Fest. You can just like go there for free. And that's a cool thing about the city is like there's just free, awesome stuff going on all the time. That's like something we're very, very proud of here. Yeah. So yeah, it's like an awesome city to visit in the summertime.
Montreal, I haven't yet been to Montreal. I've been to Vancouver, BC. I'm here in Portland. That's super easy for me to get to. Mm-hmm. I've not been to Montreal. It's been on my list for a long time. And I think after you just hearing, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take your itinerary and I'm just going to run with that myself. So maybe next summer I'm going to like barnstorm into Montreal and hit all these places, go to the Wet Chicken, do these Jazz Fest concerts, do all of it, because it sounds like a great trip. And Montreal is a very beautiful city, I would say, based on sort of what I've seen and some friends who have been there. They're like, this is a really, really great place to go.
Yeah, it's awesome. Not too many mosquitoes. It's great.
Well, so according to Statistics Canada, we're going to run through some fun facts here around tourism in Quebec. This is your own country's National Statistics Department. In the third quarter of 2023, which would basically be summer of 2023, Quebec had 1.7 million international visitors. This would make it third amongst Canadian provinces, so behind Ontario's whopping 4.9 million and British Columbia's 3.4 million. Is that a surprise to you that it's third?
Yeah, a little bit. Well, now as I said out loud, I think Quebec is much cheaper to visit than if people are going to Ontario, they're probably going to Toronto. Toronto is just like insanely expensive. Like you go there to like book a hotel room, you're looking at like 400, sometimes like $500 for a hotel room. Man, insane. It's insane. And here, I'm going to guess probably cheaper than that.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I just find Montreal a lot more interesting than Toronto, which is a very common sentiment around here, especially. So, yeah.
I've been to Toronto. It was a fun city to visit. I was there for a conference back when I was a city planner, and it was a fun city to visit because there's some cool stuff, in terms of urbanism sort of happening within sort of the Toronto area. But I wasn't overtly impressed by for lack of a better term, the geography or the buildings or anything like that. There were some cool neighborhoods, but when I compared it to, so obviously I go up to Vancouver maybe once a year, or even Victoria, British Columbia up here. Comparing it to even sort of these two places, I'm like, oh, those are geographically much more interesting for me personally. Mm-hmm. So I definitely can see what you're saying. I'm imagining Montreal is probably a little bit more beautiful, for lack of a better term. There's gonna be some Ontario natives who are gonna be really mad at me for saying this, but
yeah, I think especially having Montreal in the middle of the city, it's a big park, and it's like like you can be walking in there, and you won't even notice that you're in a city. It is like very dense forest and trails and stuff like that. It's really, really beautiful. And like you mentioned, being like urban design conference,
Yeah, it was called NACTO, National Association of City Transportation Officials. So it was a transportation thing. So we were looking at sort of the bike system, some of the bike stuff that Toronto was doing, as well as the tram system there.
Yeah, I should mention that like we have, it's called Bixi here, and I think Toronto also has it there, where it's like a public bike sharing system here.
Right, yeah.
It's a huge network, and like if you look at the bike map of Montreal, it's super extensive. It's like an awesome city to bike in. And during the summertime, especially, they close down a lot of streets and make them pedestrian only. So there's one street called Montreal, because you got to have a mountain named Montreal and a street named Montreal and basically the city named Montreal. Okay. It runs for like 5-6 kilometers, and like the whole thing is pedestrian from like June to September, and it's great. They got like art installations and stuff going on there. It's like they're really do awesome. It's really fun to just like walk in the middle of the street when you're not normally supposed to be allowed to. There's a thrill of that, and Montreal does it really, really well.
If you're living on the outskirts of Montreal and you tell somebody you're going to Montreal, is there like a common like, well, what do you mean by that? Are you going to the city? Or are you going to the street? You going to the park? What are you talking about here?
Oh yeah, that's kind of context dependent. Yeah,
does that ever get confusing?
And then there's Montreal, the metro station. It works. It eventually works. Yeah.
Well, getting back to the tourism facts. So again, maybe this is a surprise. Maybe this isn't a surprise, depending on maybe where you're from in Canada. If you're from Canada, so it's probably not a surprise, though, that the vast majority, or at least a heavy majority, of these international visitors are coming from the United States. We're right here. We're really close. Not that big of a surprise. So for Quebec, about 1 million of those 1.7 million visitors were from the US. And British Columbia and Toronto have similar figures attached to them. There's one place I want to talk about before sort of we close out today's episode, and that is Quebec City. Because I've seen some photos of it. I've not been myself. I've seen some photos, particularly of old Quebec, and this looks like the most European place you can probably get anywhere within the United States or Canada, certainly. Have you ever been? What's the experience like there?
Yeah, I've been a few times. Yeah, especially in the sort of older parts of the city. It is like, it's
Those little
windy.
cobblestone winding roads. Yeah,
Yeah,
beautiful. It looks gorgeous.
it's beautiful. It's not everywhere, but it's a pretty big part of the city. Yeah, it's really pretty. It's also along the river as well. Yeah, I will caveat Quebec, beautiful city to visit for about 2 or 3 days. After that, and this is just a warning, everybody will kind of say it. It's like, oh, okay, we've seen the old stuff, and then yeah, let's go to Montreal. And Montreal has some of their own kind of cobblestoney type of parts.
Mm-hmm.
Probably in Quebec, it's a bit more expansive and just a bit more sort of serpentine-y, like a bit more windy,
Mm-hmm.
which adds sort of like a, I don't know, a very kind of European sort of feel to it. But sorry, I don't want to derail the Quebec City
No,
portion
absolutely.
of this.
Yeah, no, that's exactly what I was looking for. I'm like, I've heard so much about like Quebec City and old Quebec, and you see these pictures, and it's like, why? Like, but I don't hear that many people actually going to visit it. And I'm like, well, if this place looks so amazing, why isn't there more tourism there? Why isn't this sort of the hot spot? I think Montreal gets most of the tourism for Quebec. And I think you nailed it. Maybe it's just like, okay, you go there, you see a little bit of this, but it's not everywhere, and it's very beautiful. And maybe it's just a 2-day stay, and you bop over to Montreal to sort of conclude your Quebec visit. Something to that effect. Or you go up to the town that you were talking about earlier. This is leading to one very final question, Trevor. Is Quebec, and you kind of already answered this, but is Quebec a place to visit in the summer, winter, neither, or both?
Yeah, so I mentioned summer for Montreal just because there's so much stuff going on, and like the weather is actually it's actually quite hot right now. It does get very humid here, so that is something to consider. So like the temperature today is something like it's 28 degrees. I think it's supposed to be that's Celsius, which is probably about 90 something in Fahrenheit. And then with the feels like temperature, it'll probably be something like high 90s or something today. So that can sort of happen. But there's just so much going on. It's great. And I'm in an air conditioned house right now, so it's perfectly fine. In winter, it's a place to visit. I'm not so sure I would recommend somebody for their first time visit here in the wintertime. But even then, in the wintertime, we do have a lot of activities going on, like a lot of ice skating in the parks. It's almost like a stereotype here, but there's a lot of parks, and yeah, they make ice rinks, and so you can skate around on ice skates for free and stuff like that. You got to rent the skates and stuff all. And then we do have a great event here. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm part of a tourism board all of a sudden, but we have this event in late February called Nuit Blanche, which is called like White Night. And basically it's like the whole city is awake the entire night. And there's just like a bunch of free festivals, and museums will be open for free. There'll be like, artists doing stuff all night. It's cold, but we have like fires going, like big bonfires and stuff going on. And it's just, the city is very alive. So even though it is cold here, that is a fun night to be here, but I would come in the summer. Yeah.
Well, go in summer, folks. If you want to go to Montreal or maybe even Quebec at large, seems like it'll be hot, maybe humid, but maybe a little bit more there to do. Maybe you won't get snowed in. I don't know. Trevor, this has been really fun exploring Quebec with you. Thank you so much for serving as our guide, not just through the geography, but also through history, and then of course playing that tourism board member for us, so that people who want to go and visit after listening to a whole episode about it can go and like get some local advice about where to go. Tell everybody where they can find you, or whatever you want to plug.
Yeah, before I cough, I'll just take a drink of water and then let's plug. Yeah, Plateau Astro. So Plateau, like flat space Astro. So that's on Instagram, Facebook, Threads. I have a blog on plateauastro.com, and then YouTube. I sometimes post longer form 10, 12 minute long videos about space and astronomy, about things that I really like to teach about.
Great.
So, yeah.
Listener, all of those links will be in the show notes if you're listening on a podcast app, or it'll be in the YouTube description if you're watching here on YouTube. Go and click on them. follow him around. I follow him on Threads mostly. It's where I'm most active in social media. And it's just good space content if you like space stuff, which I love. I'm not a space person, but I love learning about it and sort of seeing what people are talking about and what's happening up in space. I remember when the eclipse was happening, you were posting a lot, and I was like, oh, this is really cool. I'm nowhere near this eclipse and I'm not going to make it. But it's like a way to sort of like live through that event in a city that was sort of right in the path of totality. So that was really cool to see.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thanks.
Thanks for listening, everybody. This has been very fun exploring Quebec. Next week, we're going back to Europe. We're going to talk all about Portugal with my friend Gil, who runs the very popular YouTube channel General Knowledge. And yes, if you're sort of dying to know, we geography YouTubers hang out from time to time. So I have some friends who are sort of in this space. So I'm going to be pulling on them in sort of future episodes as I can. If you're listening to this on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any of those kind of stuff, please rate and review the new podcast. This is something that I'm spinning up. I really like this. This is really fun for me. I would love it if you told me if it was fun for you. If you're watching on Geography by Geoff, the YouTube channel, which is where this lives, you haven't yet subscribed, please do so. Please like the video. It helps me out just to know that I'm doing things right and well. So yeah, I guess until next week when we do Portugal, I guess stay geographical and have fun out there and go visit Quebec, I guess. Go visit Quebec. It's a beautiful place.